Russia is still counting on U.S. President Donald Trump to deliver an acceptable peace deal in Ukraine, though it's prepared to continue the war if talks fail, according to people in Moscow familiar with the matter. The Kremlin is unconcerned by Trump's threat to slap punitive secondary sanctions on Russian oil over the lack of progress toward a ceasefire, the people said. Still, President Vladimir Putin realizes that Trump represents his best chance of bringing the war to an end and wants to continue diplomacy, they said, asking not to be identified, discussing internal policy. Having promised to achieve a rapid end to Europe's worst conflict since World War II, Trump declared he was pissed off with Putin over the weekend as his frustration boiled over at the pace of negotiations. He later dialed back the criticism and said he believed the Russian leader will fulfill his part of the deal. Russia would prefer to continue certain mutual efforts to search for a settlement, which requires time and effort to achieve, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said in response to a request for comment. Everyone would prefer not to fight, but to talk, and not only to talk, but to be heard. This is what we have with the current American administration. Putin's economic envoy, Kirill Dmitriev, who is sanctioned by the U.S., said Thursday that he's holding meetings in Washington with administration officials. Opponents of rapprochement are afraid that Russia and the U.S. will find common ground, begin to understand each other better, and build cooperation, both in international affairs and in the economy, he said. The Kremlin is holding out for more U.S. concessions, including some sanctions relief and a suspension of arms deliveries to Ukraine. When talks with the U.S. last month in Saudi Arabia yielded a deal for a moratorium on attacks against Black Sea shipping, Russia announced it was making the accord conditional on getting one of its largest state banks reconnected to the SWIFT international messaging system. Trump aides, including his special envoy Steve Witkoff, had voiced optimism about progress in negotiations with Russia. The White House's aim was for a truce agreement by April 20th, a goal that now seems unlikely, and talk of a possible summit soon between Trump and Putin has faded recently. Russia announced it was conscripting 160,000 men for the spring draft on Monday, the largest such military intake in 14 years, though the defense ministry said they wouldn't be sent to the war zone in Ukraine. That's as Russia traded accusations with Ukraine over breaches of a pause in attacks on energy infrastructure that both sides agreed on with Trump. While Putin has said he wants a deal with Trump, he has also repeatedly insisted that it must resolve what he's defined as the root causes of the war. He has said Kiev must abandon its goal of joining the NATO defense alliance and accept restrictions on the size of its military, while also calling for any settlement to reflect the realities on the ground of Russian occupation of eastern and southern Ukrainian territory since the February 2022 invasion. Ukraine and its European allies, as well as the U.S. under President Joe Biden's administration, accuse Russia of trying to subjugate its neighbor. While Trump has already conceded many of Russia's demands, agreeing to all of Putin's terms would risk opening the U.S. president up to charges of weakness. Still, he made an end to the war, one of his major campaign promises. Russia has dangled the prospect of major business cooperation with the U.S., including in the Arctic and on rare earth deposits, as part of a revival of relations. Trump is also pushing Ukraine to accept an economic partnership deal that would give the U.S. control of future investment in the country's infrastructure and natural resources. Russia was among a few countries excluded from Trump's announcement of tariffs on Wednesday, though Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent later told Fox News that was because sanctions had severed trade ties. The U.S. imposed a 10% tariff on Ukraine. The Kremlin hopes it can secure a one-on-one meeting between Putin and Trump in which they hammer out a deal that stops the war in Ukraine for now, just as Trump wants, in exchange for provisions that leave Ukraine permanently weakened. Alexander Gabuev, director of the Carnegie Russia-Eurasia Center, wrote in an opinion piece with fellow experts at the organization. At the same time, Moscow was prepared to keep fighting before Trump won, and it remains so today, he said. While Russia's inching forward on the battlefield and has an advantage in manpower and arms over Ukraine, Western analysts say it has incurred massive casualties of more than 1,000 soldiers a day. A group of 50 Republican and Democratic senators this week introduced a sanctions package that would impose a 500% tariff on countries that buy Russian oil, petroleum products, natural gas, or uranium if Putin refuses to engage in good faith ceasefire negotiations with Ukraine or breaches an eventual agreement. Russia has weathered 3 years of sanctions and won't yield to threats now, as the new measures won't be any more effective, people familiar with Kremlin thinking insist. These sanctions will not affect Russia as much as they will affect other countries, those who need our oil and gas. Anatoly Aksakov, the head of the State Duma's Financial Market Committee, said in a phone interview. These are China, East Asia, developing economies. And what a surprise! The Trump administration lied, claiming no tariffs on Russia due to lack of trade, says Le Monde. America still trades with Putin. The 2024 trade balance hit $3.5 billion, more than with Mauritius or Brunei. If Belarus and Russia were on the list, tariffs would be 42% and 24%. Also, serious problems are looming for the penguins on Heard and McDonald Islands. Trump has imposed a 10% tariff on goods from the US there as well. Since no people live on the islands, the penguins and other birds residing there will have to figure it out on their own. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte. Let's not be naive about Russia. Nobody is naive about Russia. This is not only a European conflict, but with China and North Korea and Iran being involved here, supporting Russia's war effort, its onslaught on Ukraine, that it is really a global issue.
Genuinely with the negotiation process, not being honest as a partner in those negotiations. Also, regardless even of what happens in Ukraine, Russia continues to be the most significant long-term security threat to NATO and the U.S. Trump, his lead negotiator Witkoff, have said statements suggesting the exact opposite, that Russia, Putin himself, are interested in peace, engaging genuinely, incredibly in the negotiation process, and also that they do not see Russia as a long-term security threat, but rather potentially a partner in all sorts of productive and fruitful deals to be done. Can you acknowledge this discrepancy between your position and that of the Trump administration, and what does it suggest for the future of NATO cohesion?
I'm not sure it is an entirely fair assessment of the position of the US administration, but let me start from a different angle. When President Trump came in, the war was not developing in the right direction. We saw the front line moving from the east to the west, and we want the front line to move from the west to the east. It wasn't. The Russians were very slowly, and against a lot of people dying or getting seriously wounded on their side, and by the way also on the Ukrainian side, but they were making very slow progress. And we know that many people have died or are seriously injured because of this war. We know that some cities have been destroyed, the whole infrastructures have been destroyed. So for President Trump coming in to say, I want to do the utmost to bring this war to a just and lasting end, I think is commendable, and that's what I'm saying. And they're working tirelessly to do that. For NATO, it's clear. For the whole of NATO, Russia is the long-term threat, even if this war will come to an end. Let's not be naive about Russia. Nobody is naive about Russia. But when it comes to ending the war, I think it is important that the Americans are trying this, working closely with the Ukrainians, informing and updating constantly the Europeans, the French and the Brits, coming up with very practical suggestions on the next steps if we would get to a ceasefire or peace deal. And I think this is exactly how the alliance should function, working together, trying to get things done, making sure, and acknowledging that this is not only a European conflict, but with China and North Korea and Iran being involved here, supporting Russia's war effort, its onslaught on Ukraine, that it is really a global issue, and that in the end there is as I said before, there is an audience of one watching all of this. This is the first secretary of the Communist Party of China, Xi Jinping, and he wants to know at the end who comes out on top. Is it the West or is it Russia? And if it is Russia, it will give him thoughts about what he could do in his region, because he also has some territorial claims which he might want then to entertain.
Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe. Also, if you want to support Warthog Defense, please become our member and get early access to new videos, exclusive members-only videos, and become administrator in comment section. The membership link is in the description.
Rescues every day. We had a guy last week at 6 rescues in 6 days. You know, he's doing the job every day.